Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another MonkChat here with Empty Cloud Monastery. So, as usual, you're welcome to type in any questions you have about Buddhism, and I'll do my best to answer them. Usually we have a panel of monks answering questions, but today it's just me. So I'll do my best to answer your questions. Again, please type in your questions. It can be anything related to Buddhism, and I'll give my perspective. I recall there were some questions from previous sessions this week, which were off topic. So this is your chance to put in off-topic questions because there is no topic other than Buddhism. So anything even vaguely related to Buddhism is acceptable. So I'm not seeing any questions so far. If no questions appear within a short period of time, then this will make for a very short session. So I would encourage you to provide some questions and get us started. So the Buddha said that one of the karmic conditions for wisdom is that in past lives, one would go to spiritual teachers and ask them questions. So you can keep that in mind. Asking questions is something which is a karmic basis for wisdom in future lives. And of course, wisdom in this life as well. So it's through asking questions and contemplating the answers that we come to a deeper understanding of the Dhamma. So I see a few questions arising. Rick asks, many people have been introduced to meditation in MBSR and insight meditation groups. What are the benefits and limitations of these lay groups in the West? Well, first off, I should just say that I haven't actually attended any MBSR courses. So my understanding of what they teach is secondhand. So I don't really have a deep understanding, but what I have been able to pick up is that MBSR is a completely non-religious secular system for using certain mindfulness practices, which are loosely based on some of the practices we do in Buddhism. So using some mindfulness exercises in order to reduce one's stress. So, I mean, that's fine. It just isn't Buddhism. In Buddhism, we also like to burn incense and wear robes, but burning incense and wearing robes doesn't have anything to do with attaining awakening. So if they have incense-based stress reduction programs, and people ask me, how does that relate to Buddhism? I would say it doesn't. I like incense, but incense is not a path to awakening. It's just something that we like to use in Buddhism. So of course, with MBSR, the connection is slightly stronger. But again, if you're practicing mindfulness, well, that's good. Mindfulness is good. But there's a lot more to Buddhism. Mindfulness is only one small piece of what we do. So MBSR, I think overall, it's relatively wholesome. Like if it's making people a little bit happier and calmer, that's great. I like things that make people happier and calmer. If it helps to demystify meditation and help people get some acceptance that meditation is a good thing, that's also great. Good. But as for people who start with MBSR and then later move on to become sincere practitioners of Orthodox Buddhism, that's actually relatively rare in my experience. It's not particularly common. So, and it's fine. It just, I don't consider MBSR to be Buddhism, to be perfectly blunt. As for insight meditation, so insight meditation is, technically speaking, it refers to a category of practices that we do in Buddhism that are designed to lead to a deep understanding of karma, rebirth, the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, the three characteristics. So insight meditation then is a central component of Buddhism that relies upon right view. and is built upon a foundation of morality and generosity and the rest of the Noble Eightfold Path. So you cannot practice insight meditation if you're not practicing the entire Noble Eightfold Path. Otherwise, you're not practicing insight meditation. You're practicing something that maybe vaguely resembles insight meditation, but which isn't really the same thing. So similarly, there's a lot of groups that call themselves insight meditation groups, but because they are deficient in right view and because they don't teach the entire Noble Eightfold Path, I would say that properly speaking, they're not practicing insight meditation, as we call it in Buddhism. They're doing whatever it is they're doing. But if one is not firmly grounded in right view, and one is not deeply committed to the entire Noble Eightfold Path, then whatever practice one is doing, it's not leading towards awakening, and therefore it cannot be called insight meditation as we mean that term in Buddhism. So if a so-called insight meditation group, if it is incorporating the entire Noble Eightfold Path, including a strong teaching of right view, which includes, again, principles like karma, rebirth, the Four Noble Truths, the three characteristics, and so on, that's just Buddhism. And of course, I like Buddhism. Whether the groups are led by lay people or not is kind of beside the point. If people are practicing genuine Orthodox Buddhism, that's something I praise and appreciate. But I do have quite a problem with people who are teaching things contrary to Buddhism, yet claiming to be Buddhist. That I have a problem with. So there are a number of teachers who claim to be teaching Theravada Buddhism or early Buddhism or something along those lines, yet who claim that rebirth is not real, that there are no psychic powers, no devas, that there's no karma, or that karma functions only in extremely limited ways, who say that morality is not important, that generosity is not important, and so on. So those people, as far as I'm concerned, they're not Buddhist and they're not teaching Buddhism. And therefore, whatever they're doing, it cannot, properly speaking, be called insight meditation. It's some kind of meditation, that's true. Maybe it's loosely based upon Buddhism. But if it's missing that component of right view, then it's not insight meditation and it's not Buddhism. So that's actually the main limitation that I see, particularly in America. It might be different in other countries. But particularly in America, I'm seeing a strong deficiency in right view, in morality, in the Eightfold Path as a whole, in generosity and samadhi. Basically, most of the path is missing in MBSR and even in so-called insight meditation groups. Most of the path is missing. So that's a huge problem. It's not a small problem. It's a gigantic problem. So next, Bhavani asks, how to differentiate feelings, perceptions, memories, and consciousness. So in Buddhism, commonly the word that's translated as feeling in Pali is Vedana. And Vedana particularly refers to the experience of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So sukha, which means pleasure, dukkha, which means pain, and adukkama sukha, which means neither painful nor pleasant, or neutral sensation. So pleasant, painful, and neutral. That's it. So when we say the word feeling in English, we often mean emotion. But emotion would more easily fit under the category of sankhara, which I'll come to in a moment. Perception, again, the Pali term that is normally translated perception is sanya. So sanya more precisely means identification or recognition. Sanya is the process through which we identify and put a label on a sensory experience. And then often sanya also includes rewriting our experience in order to match what we think it should be, or what we expect it to be, or what we believe it is. So sanya is both the process of identifying things, but also the process of rewriting our experience based upon our expectations and opinions. Memories are, well, they're just images of things that we believe happened in the past. So images that appear in the mind, and images might also be sounds or smells or whatever, but most commonly memories take the form of images and ideas. So, and usually they arise unbidden. They're echoes of whatever we've experienced in the past. And it's basically similar to anything you hear or see. It's a sensory experience that arises and passes away. It can be observed to change, and it can be recognized to be something which we don't have much control over, and something which is not quite real, and therefore not worth making a big deal out of. As for consciousness, so normally consciousness is a translation of the Pali word vijnana. And vijnana usually is used to refer to sensory awareness. So awareness of a visual experience or awareness of an auditory experience and so on. So consciousness is awareness of sensory experience. So there's a brief rundown on these four things you asked about. I should point out, by the way, that memory would also fit under the category of sankhara. So sankhara means a conditional formation or a construct. And it commonly is used to refer particularly to mental constructs, mental formations, which includes things like emotions and memories and thoughts and ideas and so on. So Sud says, it's very difficult in lay life to progress on the path. I have made a firm determination to keep loving kindness at the center of my life, but it seems things we do in lay life are not conducive to the Dhamma. For example, driving can kill countless living beings, or living in a house and mowing a lawn can harm living beings. What are your thoughts about this? Should we all just become monks in this day and age? If you want to become a monk, send me an email and we can talk about it. It can be possible depending upon the conditions in your life. It might be a possibility for you. But as a layperson, you just do the best you can. So make a commitment to not intentionally kill anyone or hurt anyone, and consider what you can do in your life that will reduce the amount of harm that you cause. But you also recognize that as a sentient being in a physical world, that you're going to sometimes do things that harm others. But as long as it's unintentional, it's not such a big deal. So, for example, when you're mowing your lawn, well, first off, ask yourself why you have a lawn. So lawns are one of these incredibly bizarre, pointless things that people take for granted, but which are actually, one, totally unnecessary, and two, remarkably destructive to the environment. So when you're mowing your lawn, first ask yourself whether it actually makes any sense to have a lawn. The answer is no, it doesn't. So next you should be considering, how can I replace my lawn with something more ecologically friendly? So how can I convert it into something which is not destructive of the ecosystem? So you can do your own research on that. Maybe something which is actually supportive to living beings, something which provides nourishment for bees and other insects, for birds and etc. So you might consider that. Similarly, driving, consider reducing how much you drive. Do you really drive? Do you drive more than you really need to, and so on? So harm reduction is part of it. But ultimately, you make that resolution to try to follow the Eightfold Path as best you can, but also recognizing that it's very difficult to live a completely pure and blameless life. Even as a monk, it's not easy to live a completely pure and blameless life. But if you do the best you can, and you have the intention to do the best you can, then that will make up for the inevitable unintentional harm that you also cause. Kumu asks, is there a sutta where the Buddha explains transferring merit to devas and departed loved ones? Yeah, it's mentioned in a number of suttas. He doesn't go into a great deal of detail in explaining the exact mechanism of it or any of that. but it is mentioned in a number of suttas. I'd have to dig up the quotes to find it exactly, the references, but it is in the suttas in a few places. Then Will Val asks, is secular Buddhism quasi-Buddhist? Well, first off, I just want to say that the term secular Buddhism is a contradiction in terms. It's kind of like saying dry water. Like, I have no idea what secular Buddhism means. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So is secular Buddhism quasi-Buddhist? Well, actually, the word quasi originally means almost. So I would say, no, it's not quasi-Buddhist. That's giving it too much credit. It's not Buddhist at all. It's not even close. Then Taylor asks, do you have to join the Buddha to practice Buddhism? No, just start practicing. That's all. Start following the Buddha's teachings, following the practices that the Buddha taught. That's what Buddhism is. Then Taylor asks, or join the monastery where you are. Can I come on Sunday like church? We do normally have a Sunday afternoon program where you can come and practice meditation with us and listen to a Dhamma talk and ask questions, learn some meditation practices. We do normally do that every Sunday afternoon. However, for the winter months, January, February, March, we will not be open to the public in that way. It is still possible to visit the monastery, but send us an email ahead of time. So outside of the pandemic, we're normally very open to visitors, but during the pandemic, we're being much more careful about how many people we have coming at any given time. So we keep the number of people visiting very low for safety reasons. But it is possible to come and visit the monastery, and we do usually have regular public programs that people can join in. This is true of most Buddhist monasteries. Almost all Buddhist monasteries have public programs that people can join in. Sia Sud says, I feel like perfect sila is tough to practice in lay life. Just wanted your thoughts on this. Yeah, it is. It is difficult. So rather than trying to practice perfect sila, try to protect the sila that you already have and try to improve it. So aiming for perfection is difficult. So first off, try to not backslide. And second, try to slowly, gradually improve. Then Cooper says, with very few exceptions, we have to kill something in order to eat. No, I've never in my entire life had to kill something in order to eat, ever. Yeah, I've never killed something in order to eat. No. Nope, not true. And Rick asks, recent meditations have brought to light how much anger and grief I feel toward my body due to being impaired by chronic illness and pain. How do we let this go and become at peace with how things really are? So bodies are bodies. So the Buddha said the nature of bodies is that they're subject to illness, they're subject to pain. This is what they are. Why would we expect it to be anything else? So it sounds to me like you're expecting your body to always be healthy and comfortable. That's not the nature of bodies. So the first step is accepting that your body just is exactly what it is. And that's perfectly normal and natural for it to be that way. There's not really anything wrong here. It's just the way your body is. And that if you hate your body or are angry at your body, then that will just create mental suffering, which is not necessary. But if you accept your body just as it is, with all of its illness and pain and discomfort, then there'll be no suffering. You'll be perfectly fine. Even when the body is in challenging situations, you will be totally fine. And Michael asks, would you kindly speak about your upcoming wandering experience? Have you expectations? How can we support you on your journey? So since the time of the Buddha, it's been a common practice for Buddhist monks to spend periods of time wandering. So bringing an absolute bare minimum of possessions with them, not bringing money or food, and just wandering from place to place and relying upon the generosity of others. So this is a ancient practice that the Buddha himself did for many, many years, and his disciples did, and which has continued to be done from time to time to this day. So the plan is next June we'll be doing some wandering. If you'd like more information, send us an email and we'll tell you some more about it. Do we have expectations? Expectations are predetermined dukkha, as another teacher said. If you have expectations, then you're just setting yourself up to suffer. So it's better to not have expectations. You'll be much happier without expectations. And how can we support you? Well, if you come to Italy, where we'll be wandering, then you can give us alms food. That's one way you could support us. Otherwise, send us an email. We do need to collect a few supplies, so if you want to help with collecting supplies for us, that would also be much appreciated. Amaranta says, can I go there for a retirement time? I assume you mean for a retreat? So it is possible to come and stay at the monastery for a couple weeks or more. So send us an email for more information. So I see Cooper has made a number of comments, but none of them are actually in the form of questions. So I'm going to assume that they're not questions. Then Sud says, how can one attain samadhi while practicing 32 parts of the body meditation? So as I mentioned when you brought this question up the other day, I don't normally use the body parts meditation. As a minor aside, by the way, there's actually only 31 parts. The commentary later added on a 32nd one. The suttas only list 31. Minor point. So the way I practice samadhi is to pick one thing and hold your mind steady on it until the mind becomes completely still, sharp, clear, joyful, steady. So with the 32 parts, you would pick one part and hold your mind steady on that, on the experience of that. And you're trying to feel it. So for a samadhi practice, you need something which will keep the mind still. So it's not something you want to think about, something you want to feel. If you can feel it directly, then you can enter samadhi. But usually the body parts meditation is recommended for people who are having problems with lust, because it can be a very effective way of reducing one's lust. And that indirectly will support your samadhi, because if you have less lust in your mind, then it will be easier for you to stabilize the mind and enter samadhi. Because in order to enter deep samadhi, you need to let go of sensual desire. So in this way, the 32 parts meditation can indirectly support samadhi by reducing one's hindrance of sensual desire. Then Kumo says, the Samanyapala Sutta says the sense-based consciousness is tied to the body, dies when the body dies. Is a new passing on consciousness arise based on these six, which are no longer operative? So technically speaking, the sensory consciousnesses are dependent upon the current condition of body-mind. And in every moment, the current body-mind ceases to exist, and a new body-mind appears in the next moment. So that also includes the six sensory consciousnesses. They appear in each moment that a body-mind is present, and they cease when that body-mind ceases. However, the karma that we generate creates the conditions for a new body-mind to arise in the next moment. So that's why there's always a new body-mind arising, and with it, a new set of 6 consciousnesses. That's happening every single moment, not just between lives, but it happens every single moment. And Will Val says, in a previous Dhamma talk, you said, correct me if I'm wrong, that you can feel the presence of Devas. Could you please elaborate on this? Some people can feel Devas and some people can't. Some people can see them. Some people can even talk to them. If you're not one of those people, then don't bother with trying to develop that ability, because it's not part of the path to awakening. But it does sometimes arise naturally as a result of Buddhist practice. So in the course of Buddhist practice, you might find that you're able to feel the presence of devas or other spirits. And you may even get to a point where you can see them or communicate with them. But it's not something that we usually deliberately try to develop, because it's not relevant to the path of awakening. It's just a side effect that sometimes happens. So if you can't see, feel, or communicate with devas, don't worry about it. And if you can, then you don't need me to elaborate on it, because you already know. So that's that. And I don't see any other questions online. Any questions from the monastery residents? Yeah, go ahead.
Bhante, in reference to one of the Dhammapada verses that you were talking about earlier in the week, the verse regarding children and money and wealth in the realm of fools, what I was reflecting upon is how that applies to even other aspects that people may think about that hosting ourselves, such as jobs, houses, relationships, and even, do you see that, or is how that's tied into nostalgia, for example? Like one of the questions earlier was about memory and feelings, and it seems like nostalgia is one of those things that combines all those things, even though it's such a unreal and false thing. It seems like definitely the realm of fools, but it's so like it has a big pull. And I was just wondering how that all fits in with that verse. I know that verse is very specific about money and children.
I actually take that as being a stand-in for everything that we take as being a possession. So anything that we regard as mine, that is a source of suffering. And it creates a sticking, an adhesiveness in the mind, which makes it subject to suffering. Yeah, so he specifically mentioned children and wealth because these are two things which people have a very strong possessiveness about and get a lot of dukkha. People experience a lot of suffering when they lose wealth. And they also get a lot of suffering when their children do things they don't like, or when bad things happen to their children. So in both cases, it's because of that possessiveness, that attitude of possessiveness. So that's what the Buddha is pointing to. He's saying you don't even possess yourself, let alone anything else. Yet we produce so much suffering for ourselves around things that we don't possess and don't control. That's the point of that. So of course it includes everything you mentioned, jobs and so on. It's not just about children and wealth. It's about the mind of possessiveness and how that produces suffering. And nostalgia. Nostalgia is actually a very interesting emotion. So nostalgia is the craving for an idealized version of the past. So I find nostalgia very interesting. I very rarely experience nostalgia anymore. But nostalgia is an interesting one because it contains a strong element of delusion. The delusion that something we had in the past was great, and if we just had it again, that would be so great. But when we actually think more carefully, we're like, actually, it really wasn't that great. And even if I got it again, it would continue to not be that great. So what we're craving is this false image of some perfect experience which we never actually had. So nostalgia is a very interesting thing to look at more closely, and on closer examination, it just disintegrates, falls apart, which is the point of examining it.
Thank you.
Jason asks, what are some common causes of depression or anxiety in the monastic community? What is the right way to help them, or should you try to help? So of course it depends on the monastic community. So every community has its own particular conditions. Depression and anxiety are actually not particularly common in monastic communities, in my experience. Sometimes, but they're not common. So our lifestyle is one which is usually low anxiety and quite pleasant. So yeah, depression and anxiety are not particularly common in monastic communities. But it's very kind of you to ask about these things. And of course, it's always good to visit your local monastic communities and ask them how they're doing and ask what you can do to help. That's always much appreciated. And Rick asks, does Empty Cloud Monastery have needs that are not being met? Are resident monastics receiving food and supplies on a consistent basis? We actually are fairly well supported. If you do want to support, it's always good. You can send us an email and ask what our current needs are. Yeah, we're pretty well supported, so we're not struggling in any way. We're actually doing pretty well. Thank you for asking. That's very kind. Kumo says, what is your advice for us if we have to change one thing in our lives as a New Year resolution? Well, the practice of making resolutions is actually something which has been part of Buddhism since the beginning. So you make some determination to work on some part of your practice. So perhaps something that you have a particularly strong attachment to or craving for, you make a determination to indulge in that less. Or to take a break from it for a designated period of time. Or if you want to increase some development in your practice, then you make, a resolution to increase it for a period of time. So in Pali, it's called aditana, resolution. Aditana literally means superior standing. So you're making a platform for yourself that's a bit higher than what you normally do. So standing a bit taller than usual. So common things, for example, you might, if you are attached to sweets, you might say, well, I'm not going to eat desserts for 1 week. Or if you feel like you're not meditating enough, you say, well, I'm going to meditate an extra 5 minutes every day for a week. The important thing with resolutions is to start very small. If you start by saying, I'm going to meditate 6 hours a day for the rest of my life, well, that might last for a few days, but then eventually you're going to start breaking it and getting depressed and feeling like you're not up to it, and you'll just discard the resolution entirely. So 2 important things for resolutions, especially if you're new to the practice: keep them small and give them a short time limit. Again, like I'm going to meditate 5 extra minutes every day for 1 week. Very manageable, short term. Then at the end of that week, then you can think about taking on a new resolution, maybe one that's a little more intense, but do it bit by bit. If you normally have 6 cookies at lunch, well, for the next week, I'm only going to eat 5 cookies at lunch. That's something quite manageable. So in this way, over time, you can start to reduce your defilements and increase your wholesome states of mind. So there is a custom in many cultures to make resolutions at the time of New Year's, and of course that's fine. But in Buddhism, especially in monasteries, we practice resolutions all year round. So all year round, we don't wait for New Year's, but whenever we feel like we're ready to take on a resolution for a period of time, then we take on a resolution for a period of time. Yeah, so resolutions can be a very powerful way of stepping up your practice. And Rick asks, how do we maintain an inspired practice without getting lost in becoming? I'd like to make a recommendation. Don't worry about getting lost in becoming. If by getting lost in becoming, you mean the wish to become a better practitioner, a better Buddhist, a wish to become more compassionate, more wise, a wish to become someone with good samadhi and so on, that's always great. That's the kind of becoming that supports you, because eventually it leads to abandoning becoming entirely. So, as I've said a number of times in the past, the early stages of Buddhist practice are not about letting go of self. They're about replacing unwholesome self with wholesome self. You're not letting go of self in the early stages or even the middle stages. What you're doing is you're transforming unwholesome self-identities into wholesome self-identities. So unwholesome becoming into wholesome becoming. That's actually very, very good. And eventually it will lead to you letting go of becoming entirely. And I see Cooper continues to type in comments and is asking questions of the other lay people, which is very interesting because that isn't the program we have. So of course you can type whatever you want, but if you want questions to be answered, it's better to direct them towards the person leading the program, and I'll answer them if I can. Then Amaranta asks, when I meditate, sometimes my concentration is strong, but I notice I only perceive the sound of the mind. Is that a positive thing or is it a mistake? So focusing on the sound of the mind, that sounds somewhat similar to a practice which Ajahn Sumedho teaches, and some of his disciples also teach, which he called the sound of silence. It's not a practice that I commonly do, though I've done it in the past from time to time. And it's not a practice that I commonly teach, since it isn't one that I commonly do. I am a bit concerned, though, if everything else disappears. Like if your body disappears, that's usually a bad sign. So in certain deep states of samadhi, or when doing certain insight meditation practices, your body can disappear. But usually if your body disappears, that's just a sign that your mindfulness and alertness are diminishing. So it's usually not such a good sign. But if your concentration is very strong and the mind is very awake and very alert, and the body disappears, then that can be okay. That can just be a sign that your concentration is extremely good. So you need to just be clear that your mindfulness and alertness are very good. As for focusing on the sound of the mind, again, if this is the sound of silence practice that Ajahn Sumedho teaches, then it is a well-respected practice that's used in Buddhism. So I don't really see anything wrong with using that practice, although it's not one I use much myself. Then Rick says, how do we skillfully practice the Brahma Viharas with family members who actively lie, steal, engage in alcoholism and addiction, and abuse us and others? Be kind, be gentle, but also keep your distance. You do need to watch out for your own safety when dealing with abusive people. So be kind and gentle, but also protect yourself. Watch out for your own safety. Recognize that those people are suffering and they're doing what they're doing because of their suffering. So wish for them to be happy, wish for them to get the help that they need in order to overcome their problems. But recognize that you cannot change them. They have to change themselves. And sometimes all you can do is just keep your distance and wish well for them. but not letting them get close enough to harm you. But also don't have any expectations of them. Wish for them to get better, but don't expect them to get better. You can't guarantee that they will. And Yulia asks, how is Stan doing? He's doing great, actually. He's in really good health these days. He's a really lovely little kitty. And Sud asks, what is the best way to help those who lack merit? Can we do merit for them and transfer our merit to them? Is it like spiritual cash? Technically speaking, you cannot give merit to somebody else. So the Buddha does talk about transferring merit, and that's a more complicated issue. But technically what he talks about is dedicating merit to someone in particular, and that can call their attention to the goodness that you're doing. And that allows them to appreciate that goodness and therefore to generate merit of their own. So technically speaking, if somebody is lacking merit, what you can do is, dedicate merit to them, have metta for them. That does reach people. But also it's just displaying what it is to be a good person. So displaying your own goodness and the happiness that comes from being a good person. That's often what transforms people over time. So be gentle to them, be kind to them, encourage them to make merit. Demonstrate to them that you make merit and that it brings a lot of happiness to your life. And eventually they might come around. And Rick and Sud both say they appreciate the Amazon wish list. I'm happy you use the Amazon wish list. There are also some things which cannot be got on Amazon. So if you send us an email, then we can tell you what those things are. So believe it or not, there are some things which are not on Amazon. Nonetheless, we do use an Amazon wish list because it is very convenient for especially the people around the world who help out the monastery. And Proto-Dhamma asks, how can I let go of a relationship that didn't work out and feels extremely painful to give up? If it didn't work out, why are you holding on to it? You're just holding on to pain, that's all. It didn't work out, so let it go. Move on. Also recognize that relationships cannot be relied upon for happiness. Ultimately, happiness is something that we cultivate within ourselves through our own development of tranquility, equanimity, kindness, gentleness, stability, and serenity of mind. This is the true basis of our happiness. We cannot rely upon other people. So relationships are a very dangerous way to generate happiness because they rely upon other people doing what we want them to do, which is very unreliable. So it's not to say you should avoid relationships. In fact, it can be quite helpful to cultivate wholesome, supportive relationships with wholesome people who are committed to spiritual practice. That can be very supportive. The Buddha highly encouraged developing wholesome spiritual friendships. But if a relationship didn't work out, which again, it depends on what exactly you mean by didn't work out, but I'm assuming that means that it didn't turn out to be supportive for both people involved. Well, then you just recognize, well, then if it didn't work out, then it's a good thing that it ended, eh? What's the problem? There's no problem here. The problem is that there's probably some craving in your mind based upon an idealized idea of what you thought that relationship could have been. In other words, it's craving for a fantasy. So a relationship begins and we start fantasizing about how great it will be as long as it goes the way we want it to. And it doesn't go that way. So that fantasy which we produced and craved never comes into being. So then we suffer, not because we lost the relationship, but because we lost our fantasy, which was never real in the first place. So when you reflect on this, it's like, oh, I didn't actually lose a good relationship. I lost a desirable fantasy, which was never real. I didn't lose anything real. I just lost a fantasy. So the problem here is that we got wrapped up in the fantasy in the first place. So watch that mind, which generates fantasies and falls for its own imaginings. And Alex asks, what psychic powers did the Buddha have? Has anybody else been known to have similar powers? So there's actually a standard list of psychic powers, which is found in the suttas in many places, and the Buddha did have all of these powers. So it includes things like mind reading, telepathy, teleportation, telekinesis, various abilities along those lines. So the Buddha had all those abilities. Many of his direct disciples also had those abilities. And even to this day, you can find people who have those abilities. Some of them are the product of concentration, therefore not necessarily the product of wisdom. But many are, in fact, the product of development along the path. So sometimes psychic powers arise simply as a side effect of our practice. And other times, again, people will intentionally cultivate samadhi with the intention of producing these kinds of abilities. But in Buddhism, we don't normally encourage that. In one sutta, the Buddha said there's two kinds of miracles. The miracle of psychic powers and the miracle of teaching Dhamma. And he said, of these two, the miracle of teaching Dhamma is far more miraculous. Yes, there are psychic powers. Yes, the Buddha had a lot of them. Telekinesis, teleportation, telepathy, and so on. Yes, many people also develop these abilities, but they're not strictly Buddhist things. Many non-Buddhist people develop these same powers, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with wisdom. So don't put too much importance on them. Just focus on developing the wisdom which sees through dukkha, which lets go of delusion. That's what's really important. That's the last of the questions from online. So if there's any other questions, you'll have a few more seconds to ask. Otherwise, if no more questions appear, then we'll go ahead and wrap up the session. Here's another question. So Eugene asks, in whatever form death may present itself, sudden or slow, what is the best way to conduct our mind during the process of death? What should we focus on? So the important thing is not actually what you do at the time of death. It's what you do the rest of your life, because that will determine what your mind is like at the time of death. At the time of death, usually people fall back on the habits that they've cultivated during their life. So if during your life you're cultivating habits of mindfulness, concentration, equanimity, kindness, wisdom, then that's what you'll be doing at the time of death. Whereas if during your life you build up fantasy and distraction and confusion and greed and hatred and so on, then that's what your mind will do at the time of death. So what should you do during the process of death? Well, the same thing you do during the process of life, which is to cultivate wholesome mind states. And the more you develop the habit of wholesome mental activity during life, then the easier it will be to do that during the process of death as well. And Victor asks, someone told me the 31 level of being from hell to Brahma is never in suttas, but is in commentary, which comes later. Actually, in the suttas, there are 30 layers of existence, which actually forms a very neat set, 3 sets of 10, which is a very neat system that actually is mentioned in countless suttas. So I don't know who told you it's not in the suttas, because they're definitely wrong. It's in many suttas. What was added in the commentary is the commentary added a 31st realm of existence. So the realm of the asuras. So in the suttas, asuras are a certain category of deva. So they're included in the deva realms, the lower deva realms. But in the commentaries, they created a new realm specifically for asuras, and they recategorized asuras as a negative rebirth, which is positioned below humans in the hierarchy of planes of existence. And this also disrupts the neat symmetry of 3 sets of 10 realms. And because then we have 11, 10, 10, which breaks the symmetry, which is not so nice. So that's what the commentary added. It reclassified asuras from being a positive deva rebirth to being a negative rebirth below the human realm. So that's not in the suttas, that's just in the commentary. But the other 30 realms of existence are definitely mentioned in the suttas in many places. So Sud says, I follow my spouse's religion, but it is only to appease them on the outside. I know for a fact that Dhamma is the only way. Is this conceit? Would this be lying and therefore breaking the second precept? At some point, you're going to want to talk to your spouse about this. It's not good to keep big secrets from your spouse, especially things like this. If you're practicing Buddhism and it's really important to you, then be committed to it, but also be honest with other people, especially people who are very close to you, which hopefully your spouse is someone who's close to you. Be honest about what you believe, what you practice. I would also recommend just be very clear that your spouse doesn't need to change. They can keep believing whatever religion they want, practicing whatever religion they want, just as you have a right to believe and practice whatever religion you want. And you can still have a wonderful relationship, even a wonderful marriage for the rest of your life. It's quite possible. But it's going to require that each one of you accept each other's different religious practices and viewpoints. So it's quite possible, but it is going to require a sincere commitment. But yeah, it's not good to keep these things secret for long. It'll just keep burning you on the inside. So that's the last question. So if there's nothing else, then we'll go ahead and wrap up for the evening. Anything else? Yes, go ahead.
Related to the last question. I mean, what's to stop someone from practicing Buddhism and another religion?
So what's to stop someone from practicing Buddhism and another religion? Well, it depends upon what you're practicing from the other religion. And it also depends on what the other religion is. So it is possible to integrate practices from other religions into a Buddhist practice, as long as you keep Buddhism as number one. Then you can incorporate other things to the extent that they don't contradict or interfere with Buddhism. So this is actually something that we see throughout pretty much every Buddhist country. So in Japan, most people are both Buddhist and Shinto, and they practice both of them together. In China, it's very common for people to be Buddhist as well as Taoist and Confucian. That's actually a little more problematic because there's certain elements of Confucianism that contradict Buddhism. Similarly, certain elements of Taoism that contradict Buddhism. So in those cases, you actually do need to decide which one is number one and which one has to be adjusted to accommodate the number one position. Similarly, in Thailand, people commonly practice both Buddhism and animism. But again, there's a clear sense that Buddhism is number one, usually. It's also quite common for people to practice elements of Hinduism while also being Buddhist, which again is fine as long as you don't take on the elements of Buddhism that contradict, as long as you don't take on the elements of Hinduism that contradict Buddhism. Similarly, there are people who integrate Christianity, especially Catholicism, with Buddhism with various degrees of success. Usually it does involve rewriting certain Catholic concepts to Buddhify them. Similarly, many flexible Jews will be Buddhist and incorporate much of Jewish practice, but again, there's a certain accommodation process of adjusting certain Jewish concepts. So it can be done, but usually you're going to wind up adjusting certain concepts from the secondary religion. Yeah, as far as having two religious systems, which you both give equal importance and equal weight in your mind, I can't even imagine how that would work. Because Buddhism has some specific concepts which are incompatible with some of the concepts found in most other religions. Concept of no self, the concept that there's no omnipotent, omniscient being. Like, these are things which don't square well with other religions unless you're willing to modify the standard doctrines of those other religions or interpret those doctrines in different ways. And to be honest, this often isn't really a problem for people. Like the standard interpretations of religions outside Buddhism, and Buddhism is actually a pretty crystal clear, rock solid system, but most other religions are actually much hazier and offer a very wide range of interpretation. So, for example, people who practice both Buddhism and Christianity, usually it comes up with taking on a particular interpretation of what God means in such a way that it doesn't conflict with Buddhism. And there's many ways that you can do that. But it does mean that your super Orthodox Christian friends will find your take on certain Christian concepts to be a little bit weird. But then the question also is, where did they get their interpretations of Christianity from? And is their viewpoint necessarily ultimately true? So there's a lot of haziness and room for interpretation in most religions. And you can use that to your advantage when incorporating it into a Buddhist practice. Does that answer your questions or just create more questions?
Both.
Okay. And Adi says, I used to try to Buddhify my previous religion, but it never worked out too well. So I just dropped my previous religion and kept Buddhism. Yeah, I mean, realistically, that's often the cleanest way of doing things. So you can appreciate the good things in other religions, but that doesn't necessarily mean you need to try to tie yourself into knots trying to keep them. So that's the last question. Anything else? No? So we'll go ahead and end the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next week.